The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, the only sound breaking the tense silence. Miss Roberts, with her eyes fixed on the board, seemed almost oblivious to the storm swirling in the room. She was used to power, used to control, used to the way her classroom revolved around her. But Jasmine wasn't like the others. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't scared. She was a force waiting to be reckoned with. As Miss Roberts droned on about symbolism, Jasmine's eyes flickered from the board to the rest of the class. Her fingers, still curled tightly around the desk, were the only thing betraying her calm exterior. She wasn't just taking this. No, she was observing. She was thinking. Each time Miss Roberts silenced her, each time the teacher chose to ignore her, it built something, an ember. It started small, but it was there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The other students, caught somewhere between fascination and fear, could feel it too. The tension in the room had grown, thick and suffocating, like a storm about to break. Some of them looked down, unwilling to witness what was coming. Others, however, watched Jasmine closely, their expressions a mix of awe and uncertainty. They had seen how Miss Roberts treated her, had felt the sharp bite of her condescension, the dismissive wave of her hand. They couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if Jasmine pushed back? Miss Roberts, as if sensing something shifting, tried to regain control of the room. She called on another student, her voice sharper now, her smile forced. But even at that moment, even as she tried to push the class forward, her gaze kept darting to Jasmine. It was as if the teacher was waiting for something she knew was coming but couldn't quite put her finger on. Jasmine wasn't going to let it go. She wasn't going to be silenced. The injustice of it all, the way Miss Roberts twisted the conversation, the way she ignored her, the way she dismissed the very real struggle that was woven into the fabric of the novel, wasn't something Jasmine could overlook. Not anymore. She had been quiet long enough, and now it was time for her to stand up. But what would happen when she did? Would she be heard? Or would the storm Miss Roberts had been brewing for years finally break over her head? Jasmine could feel the eyes on her, but she refused to let the weight of them break her. Each snide remark, every condescending comment from Miss Roberts only strengthened her resolve. It was like she was building a wall around herself, brick by brick, each slight adding to the foundation of her defiance. The classroom, once a place of routine and predictability, now felt like a battleground. Miss Roberts was the general, commanding her troops with cruel precision. But Jasmine? She was no longer just a soldier in this war. She was the resistance. As the minutes ticked by, Miss Roberts' attempts to belittle Jasmine grew more and more frantic. Every action was scrutinized, every word twisted. A new layer of malice was added to her tone, as if she believed that crushing Jasmine's spirit would somehow bring her back into line. But Jasmine wouldn't bend. She couldn't. The thought of backing down, of letting Miss Roberts break her, was unthinkable. And so she endured. The silence in the room grew heavy, each tick of the clock like a reminder of the tension, the pressure, and the scrutiny. Her classmates, some uncomfortable, some fascinated, began to feel the weight of the situation too. Those who once ignored the subtle power plays in the room now saw them for what they were. A few, like Sarah, the girl in the front row, offered furtive glances of sympathy, their faces twisted in discomfort at Miss Roberts' behavior. Others, less empathetic, whispered behind their hands, their eyes glinting with cruelty. But Jasmine wasn't looking for sympathy. She didn't need it. In that moment, she was something more, something far stronger. With every sneer, with every unjust reprimand, the fire inside her burned brighter. Miss Roberts may have had power in the classroom, but Jasmine had something far more dangerous: the truth. It wasn't just the teacher's cruelty that was at play here. It was the system, the years of tradition, the way power had been handed down through generations. Miss Roberts had never expected a student like Jasmine to challenge her, to see through the thin veil of authority and speak out against the injustice. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something much larger, something the teacher had overlooked in her arrogance. The room seemed to close in on Jasmine as Miss Roberts continued her tirade. But even amid this storm, Jasmine remained steady, her quiet strength unwavering. She wasn't going to let Miss Roberts define her, not now, not ever. She was no longer just a student. She was a force, and the classroom was her battlefield. The room fell deathly silent as Miss Roberts, now towering over Jasmine, placed herself in the center of the classroom like a gatekeeper, blocking the students' view of the presentation board. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Jasmine stood tall, her back straight, despite the storm of anger swirling inside her. Miss Roberts, however, had the air of someone who is about to make an example of her. "Let me make something clear," Miss Roberts said, her voice chilling. "This is a classroom, not a platform for your agendas." Her words hung in the air, sharp and biting. The venom in her tone was unmistakable, a message directed not only at Jasmine but at the entire class. She was in control, and she would make sure they knew it. Jasmine's heart raced, but her gaze remained locked on the teacher. Every inch of her body screamed for justice, screamed to take back control of the narrative. She had spent hours, days even, crafting her presentation methodically, thoughtfully. This wasn't just about academic success. This was about standing up against everything Miss Roberts represented, everything she had attempted to silence. Miss Roberts continued, her words now aimed at undermining Jasmine's every effort. "You may have a lot of fancy sources, but they don't change the fact that your analysis is riddled with personal emotion, not objectivity." The words were meant to sting, meant to force Jasmine into submission. But they had the opposite effect. Every word that tried to put her down only reinforced Jasmine's conviction. "I'm not here to validate your interpretation," Miss Roberts added, her eyes narrowing. "I'm here to teach you how to separate personal feelings from facts, how to appreciate literature for its true value, not to use it as a soapbox." A few of the students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with Miss Roberts' blatant attack. Jasmine could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter. Her focus was unwavering. She had prepared for this moment. "I understand your point, Miss Roberts," Jasmine said, her voice firm but calm. "But I believe literature is meant to reflect the world we live in. It's not just about facts, it's about truth. And the truth is, this novel's themes are deeply relevant to what's happening in our society today." Her words were measured but firm, a calm rebuttal to the teacher's barrage of condescension. For a moment, Miss Roberts' lips pressed into a thin, almost imperceptible line. She hadn't expected this. Jasmine wasn't cowering. She wasn't backing down. She was standing her ground, and that was something Miss Roberts couldn't stand. "Well, Miss King," the teacher said, her voice now tight with irritation, "we'll see how well your truth is received by the rest of the class, won't we?" With that, she stepped back, crossing her arms as she watched Jasmine's next move with calculated scrutiny. Jasmine, still composed, looked out over her classmates. She knew this moment could either make or break her, both in terms of her standing in the class and the larger fight she was waging against Miss Roberts' ignorance. But as she continued her presentation, there was something undeniable in her posture. She wasn't just presenting an analysis anymore. She was making a statement that spoke to every person who had ever been silenced, pushed aside, or told they didn't belong. Jasmine's voice was strong now, unwavering in its conviction. She wouldn't let Miss Roberts, or anyone else, define what she was capable of. The door to the classroom swung open with a quiet but unmistakable force, and in walked a figure that none of the students had expected. Jasmine's father, tall and imposing, stepped into the room with the same quiet authority that echoed in his daughter's presence. His eyes scanned the room briefly, making eye contact with every student, before they settled on Miss Roberts, who stood frozen behind her desk, her smug smile faltering. The classroom, which had been thick with tension only moments before, fell into an eerie silence. The students sat back in their chairs, most of them wide-eyed, waiting for the inevitable confrontation to unfold. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but there was a strange calm that washed over her as she looked up at her father. He didn't look angry, just steady, as though he had been prepared for this moment for much longer than anyone could imagine. Miss Roberts, attempting to regain some semblance of control, straightened her posture and cleared her throat. "Mr. King, I'm glad you could join us," she said, her voice tinged with false sweetness. "I've called this meeting to discuss your daughter's performance in my class." She made sure to emphasize the word performance, as if it held the weight of a damning judgment. Jasmine's father nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand, Miss Roberts. But before we get into the specifics of my daughter's performance, I think it's important that we address something quite evident in this classroom." His voice was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath the words that made every eye in the room shift nervously. Miss Roberts raised an eyebrow, her mouth tightening into a thin line. "And what might that be?" she asked, but there was a slight edge to her tone now, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. Jasmine's father stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "The treatment of my daughter. I've been listening to her, hearing about what's been happening in this class. And from what I've gathered, it seems there's been a pattern of behavior that goes beyond academic critique. You've been singling her out, Miss Roberts, in ways that I'm sure are not appropriate for any educator. The way you've belittled her, interrupted her, and now called her disruptive? It's not about the curriculum, is it? It's about something else." The room was still, the only sound the occasional shift of student seats as they tried to avoid looking directly at Miss Roberts. Jasmine felt a surge of pride well up in her chest, and yet there was a weight to it, a fear of what would come next. Her father was standing up for her, but this was Miss Roberts. Her power in that classroom was undeniable, and Jasmine had seen it for months. But there was something different in the way Miss Roberts responded this time. Her face was flushed with anger, but the kind of anger that came from being caught in a lie, from realizing that her authority was being challenged in a way she had never anticipated. Miss Roberts started, but her words faltered, her composure cracking just slightly. "I'm simply trying to maintain academic standards," she stammered, though her voice wavered under the pressure of Jasmine's father's unwavering stare. "Your daughter's personal beliefs are interfering with her ability to perform academically." "Performance?" Jasmine's father repeated, his tone colder now. "You're talking about performance as though this is just some game. As though education is just a matter of fitting into your narrow mold. Jasmine has been performing, Miss Roberts. She's been excelling in her ability to think critically and question the world around her. It's you who has failed to see that." Jasmine could feel her heart beating faster, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something else. Empowerment. Her father was fighting for her. And more than that, he was calling out the very injustice that had been lingering in that classroom for weeks. Miss Roberts opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. It was as if the power she once held over the room had been drained from her in an instant, and for the first time, she didn't know how to respond. Jasmine's father stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I've raised my daughter to understand the value of education and the importance of standing up for what's right. And if that means challenging the status quo, then so be it." His voice was firm, clear, and without hesitation. A beat passed before Miss Roberts finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost trembling. I'll take that into consideration," she said, her words lacking the same certainty they had held just moments before. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but no one moved. The classroom seemed frozen, suspended in time. Miss Roberts stood behind her desk, her face pale, her control slipping further and further away. Jasmine's father gave her one last look before turning to leave the room, his daughter walking silently beside him. As they stepped out into the hallway, Jasmine felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just a victory over one teacher. It was a victory over a system that sought to silence her, invalidate her, and push her into conformity. She had found her voice. And for the first time in that classroom, it had been heard. As Miss Roberts entered the conference room, she took a seat at the table, her posture still rigid with the belief that she was in control. She was completely unaware that the man sitting across from her, Mr. King, was not just a school principal, but also Jasmine's father. She had assumed their connection was merely coincidental, but the reality was about to hit her with full force. Mr. King closed the door behind him with a soft click, the sound amplifying the growing tension. He took his time to sit, maintaining a calm demeanor as Miss Roberts shuffled her papers, still oblivious to the shift in power. She started outlining her concerns with Jasmine's academic performance as if the criticism was just another routine matter. "The problem," Miss Roberts began, "is that Jasmine simply isn't adapting to the standards of the class. Her focus on racial issues in literature, particularly in To Kill a Mockingbird, is distracting, and I'm concerned she might be disrupting the learning environment for others." She looked up, expecting support from Mr. King, but his face was unreadable. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice even but tinged with something more. "Tell me, Miss Roberts, how exactly does a student's focus on racial injustice disrupt learning? Isn't that the very heart of To Kill a Mockingbird? Or are we now dismissing such themes in favor of a more convenient curriculum?" Miss Roberts's confident facade faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, determined to stick to her narrative. Jasmine's approach is too personal, too political. She needs to learn how to separate her own opinions from academic analysis. Mr. King leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. And would you say that's the case with all students or just Jasmine? Miss Roberts hesitated, the tension thick in the air. Well, because from where I'm standing, Mr. King interrupted smoothly, it seems as though Jasmine is the only one being scrutinized for expressing critical thought. Let's not forget, Miss Roberts, that you've made several pointed comments in class about her, comments that are far beyond what's expected from an educator. He let the words settle in the room, watching as Miss Roberts's face flushed with the first stirrings of real discomfort. Jasmine, he continued, has been analyzing the text in ways that challenge the status quo. She's doing exactly what we want our students to do: think critically and engage with difficult topics. But it seems you've made it personal, instead of treating her like the student she is. The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Roberts, who had prided herself on maintaining authority in the classroom, now found herself cornered by the very man who held the key to her professional future. The irony of the situation seemed lost on her for a moment, as her lips parted, but no words came out. Perhaps, Mr. King added, his voice cool, we should have a deeper conversation about what is truly inappropriate in a classroom. Maybe you should reconsider your own biases before you try to address those of your students. Miss Roberts opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that her prejudices had been laid bare, exposed by a father standing up for his daughter. Outside the conference room, the class remained in hushed anticipation, the whispered exchanges among students reflecting their awareness that something monumental was unfolding. Jasmine sat straighter in her seat, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The door behind her had closed, but beyond it, justice was finally being served, and her father was the one ensuring it would be. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and when the door opened again, Miss Roberts walked in, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. Mr. King followed, his demeanor unwavering. Without a word, Jasmine's father turned and faced the class. His eyes swept the room, locking with each student's gaze before landing on his daughter. The briefest of smiles tugged at the corner of his mouth, a silent affirmation that Jasmine had not only survived but had triumphed. Miss Roberts, visibly shaken, took her place at the front of the room. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths, and Jasmine could feel the weight of it settle over her like a cloak. From that moment on, the dynamic in the classroom would never be the same. Jasmine had stood tall in the face of injustice, and with her father by her side, they had delivered a quiet but undeniable blow to the system that sought to silence her with a tidal wave. She could no longer hide behind her veneer of professionalism. Her true feelings were out in the open, and they had just been exposed in front of the one person who held the power to make it all unravel. Mr. King stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he watched Miss Roberts struggle to regain her composure. The weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. This wasn't just about academic performance anymore. It was about something far deeper, something Miss Roberts had failed to recognize until now. "You've made some very concerning remarks, Miss Roberts," Mr. King continued, his voice still calm but now laced with an unmistakable authority. It's clear that Jasmine's academic abilities are not the issue here. The issue is your inability to recognize the value of diverse perspectives. Your bias has interfered with her education, and that is something I will not tolerate. Miss Roberts took a shaky breath, trying to gather her thoughts, but her words failed her. She was no longer in control of the conversation, and she knew it. I didn't mean to. You've made your intentions very clear, Mr. King interrupted, his tone sharp now. And I assure you, Miss Roberts, I'll be addressing this with the school board. This isn't just about one student. This is about the kind of environment you're creating here, one that stifles critical thinking and punishes students for challenging ideas. That's not the kind of learning environment we want at this school. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Miss Roberts stood there, dumbfounded, unable to formulate a response. She had thought herself untouchable, but in an instant, everything had changed. The school principal, a figure of authority she had once felt superior to, had just flipped the script on her in a way she couldn't have anticipated. As Miss Roberts stammered, Mr. King turned and addressed the classroom. "Class is dismissed," he announced, his voice strong and steady. "Jasmine, I'll be speaking with you shortly." Jasmine, who had been waiting anxiously in her seat, stood up slowly, her heart pounding. She had no idea what her father would do next, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be just. The tension in the room hung thick as she moved towards the door, her classmates' eyes following her every step. Some were wide with shock, others with disbelief. It was as if a whole new reality had just unfolded before them, one in which their teacher was no longer the unquestioned authority. Mr. King's presence in the classroom completely shifted the power dynamic. His words had struck at the heart of the injustice that Jasmine had endured, and now it was clear that the tables were turning. As the door closed behind them, Jasmine felt a surge of hope and gratitude. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was finally being heard. Each word landed with surgical precision, leaving Miss Roberts speechless. The students, who had been silently absorbing the tension, now watched as their teacher's facade crumbled. The principal's words, backed by the undeniable weight of authority, painted a picture of a teacher who had long ignored the core values of education, respect, inclusion, and the importance of diverse perspectives. Miss Roberts tried to gather her composure, but it was clear that the damage was irreversible. Her eyes flicked nervously toward Jasmine, who now stood at the back of the room, her posture straight and unwavering. A quiet strength seemed to radiate from her, the weight of weeks of mistreatment now replaced by the undeniable power of truth. Mr. King continued, his voice even but laced with disappointment. The role of the teacher is to guide, to challenge students to think critically and expand their worldview. It is not to stifle their voices simply because those voices are uncomfortable or don't fit within your personal biases. Jasmine has done nothing wrong except push the boundaries of your limited perspective. Miss Roberts tried to protest, her voice barely audible. But she's so defiant. Defiance. Mr. King interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Or is it that you mistake critical thinking for defiance because it challenges your authority and assumptions? You see, Miss Roberts, this isn't just about one student. This is about fostering an environment where all students feel valued, heard, and encouraged to grow. And it's clear that you failed in that regard. A ripple of realization seemed to spread through the class. For the first time, many of the students saw their teacher in a new light, her biases now exposed in front of everyone. They had been complicit in her actions, sitting quietly while Jasmine had been treated unfairly. But now, the truth was out. The power dynamics in the room had shifted completely. Miss Roberts, now visibly shaking, looked around the room at her students, her confidence shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Mr. King turned to address the class, his gaze softer but still carrying the weight of what had just transpired. I want you all to remember something. We are all part of a community here, a community that thrives on respect, understanding, and the ability to challenge one another in constructive ways. But some things need to change in this classroom. I trust that moving forward, we can create a space where every student feels safe to express their ideas without fear of discrimination or humiliation. Jasmine's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude as she absorbed Mr. King's words. She had never expected this kind of support, certainly not from the very man who had once seemed so distant. But now, with him standing firmly beside her, she felt empowered in a way she never had before. Miss Roberts, defeated and humiliated, slowly made her way to the door. The students watched as she left the room, her head bowed in shame. As the door closed behind her, the tension in the classroom evaporated, replaced by a sense of liberation. The students, who had been so afraid of challenging authority, now felt emboldened to stand up for what was right. Mr. King turned to Jasmine, offering her a small, reassuring smile. You did well, Jasmine. Don't let anyone make you feel small for speaking your truth. Jasmine nodded, her voice steady. Thank you, Dad. The room buzzed with murmurs as the students processed the dramatic turn of events. But for Jasmine, this moment marked the beginning of something much greater. She knew that this victory, though a hard one, was just the first step in breaking down the barriers that had been placed in front of her. As the bell rang and the students began to file out of the room, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer alone in facing them. Jasmine's story became a turning point not just for her, but for the entire school community. Her courage in standing up against injustice created ripples of change that reached far beyond the classroom. She had gone from being a student dismissed and belittled to becoming a leader in the fight for respect and equality. As weeks passed, the school transformed. Teachers and students participated in ongoing workshops about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The administration made it clear that there would be zero tolerance for any form of discrimination, ensuring that the lessons learned from this incident would not be forgotten. Jasmine's classmates, who once hesitated to stand up, now rallied behind her, committed to making their school a safer, more welcoming place for everyone. For Jasmine, the road ahead was filled with both challenges and hope. While she knew that this was just the beginning of a larger battle for equality, she felt empowered to continue speaking her truth and leading by example. She had not only found her voice, but had helped others find theirs as well. As the school year continued, Jasmine's journey became an inspiration to many. Her story was a reminder that change is never easy, but with persistence, courage, and a commitment to justice, it is possible to make a difference. Jasmine, with her father by her side, knew that no matter what obstacles came her way, she would face them head-on, determined to create a world where everyone could be seen, heard, and respected for who they truly are.